농부시장마르쉐가 주최하고 파타고니아가 후원하는 2024 지구농부 포럼 농사, 지구의 회복력을 만들다. 지구농부 포럼은 지금 기후위기에 맞서 생산자와 소비자가 함께 지혜를 모으자는 취지로 시작된 행사입니다. 올해로 세 번째를 맞았습니다. 이 자리에 함께 해주셔서 정말 반갑고 감사드립니다.
안녕하세요. 세 번째 맞는 지구농부 포럼에 오신 여러분들 환영합니다. 80년 만에 가장 이른 봄이 왔다고 뉴스에서 얘기하더라고요. 저희 어제 저녁 때 저희 농부님들 이렇게 같이 저녁 식사도 하고 뭐 같이 주무신 분들도 계셨는데요. 농부님들이 육묘장 온도가 너무 이렇게 갑작스럽게 올라서 모종이 웃자라 버릴 것 같다고 걱정을 하셨습니다. 모종이 이렇게 초세를 그르치면 다시 심어야 되는 그런 번거로운 수고를 또 하셔야 합니다. 기후위기는 그런 우리 농부님들의 일상을 가뜩이나 어려운데 더욱더 고단하게 합니다. 혹자들은 말합니다. 자본집약적인 농사, 적정 규모화, 테크놀로지 이런 것들이 기후위기 시대의 어떤 농업 해법이 아니겠냐고요. 우리 농업의 자본 집약도는 정말 가파르게 올라가고 있습니다. 하지만 자본 생산성은 반대로 하락하고 있다는 통계를 우리는 접할 수 있습니다. 예를 들어서 마르쉐에 메론을 내는 한 농부님이 계신데요. 요즘 토종 재배 기술을 배울 수가 없어서 갑갑하기만 합니다. 농업기술센터에 가면 젊은 사람이 왜 양액 재배하지 토경 재배를 배우려고 해 라는 핀잔을 들어야 합니다. 우리나라 농업의 길은 무엇이어야 할까요? 4,000년의 농부라는 오래된 책이 있습니다. 100여 년 전에 미국의 토양과학자 프랭클린 히람캉이라는 토양과학자가 쓴 책인데요. 전통적인 농업의 가능성을 찾아서 동아시아를 여행하고 그때 적은 전문기입니다. 그는 동아시아의 농부들이 유기물을 귀하게 사용하고 또 콩농사를 함께 지으면서 미국 농부들의 정말 10분의 1도 안 되는 그런 땅에서 땅을 일구면서 자급하고 자신들의 토양을 대대로 물려가고 있다는 사실에 놀랍니다. 4,000년을 이어온 논들, 4,000년을 이어온 밭들, 모든 흙으로부터 온 것을 귀하게 쓰고 다시 귀하게 되돌리면서 이어져 오는 아시아의 농민농업의 전통은 지금 우리들에게 이어져 오고 있습니다. 지구 열화의 시대를 살아가고 있죠. 우리의 모든 삶의 방식에 변화가 필요한 때입니다. 이전의 방식대로 생산하고 또 이전의 방식대로 소비한다면 우리의 미래는 더 이상 없습니다. 그리고 이것을 깨달은 농부들은 어떻게 농사를 지을지를 고민하면서 이 지구농부 프로젝트를 시작했습니다. 지구농부들은 보존식 이란을 활용해서 경운을 줄여가고 또 토양을 헐벗지 않도록 피복했습니다. 자연으로부터 유기물들을 온전하게 자연으로 다 되돌리고 화학물질을 인위적으로 투입하는 것을 하지 않았습니다. 우리들의 농가 밭은 자연스럽게 생명다양성의 풍요로운 서식지 공간이 되었습니다. 우리가 이어가는 씨앗들이 꽃 피우고 열매 맺으면서 아름다운 경작지를 이루었고요. 또 다년생 작물이 어우러지는 숲밭이 만들어졌습니다. 이런 새로운 농업적 경관을 만들고 그 안에서 자급하고 연결되고 공동체를 지속하게 하는 새로운 농사가 지구농부들의 현장에서 실험되고 있습니다. 이들 지구농부들은 자연농, 퍼머컬처, 바이오다이나믹, 탄소농업, 재생유기농업 다양한 방법의 농사를 짓고 있습니다. 하지만 이들은 모두 토양의 생명력을 회복해 간다라는 공통점을 가지고 있습니다. 우리는 오랜 농민농업의 전통 속에서 이어오는 것들을 귀하게 여기고 그만큼 현재의 위기를 가속하고 우리들의 농사짓는 삶을 지속 가능하지 않게 가로막는 것들을 극복하기 위해서 다양한 실험과 변화를 소중하게 생각합니다. 지구농사는 어떤 정형화된 이론이나 개념이 아닙니다. 기후위기 속에서 농민농업의 현장에서 고민하고 실천하고 경험한 것을 그리고 그 속에서 깨닫는 것들을 가지고 함께 공유하고 연대하고 실천하려는 그런 노력을 표현하고 있습니다. 이 자리에는 이런 지구농부들이 모여 계시고요. 또 이 지구농부들과 함께 연대하려는 많은 분들이 함께하고 계십니다. 올해로 4년째 지구농부 프로젝트를 응원하고 계시는 파타고니아도 함께하고 계시고요. 또 정은정 선생님, 이시도르 연구소의 유병덕 소장님을 비롯한 연구자들 그리고 수많은 현장 농부님들이 함께하고 계십니다. 그리고 올해는 특히 한국 유기농업 연구에 중추라할 수 있는 농진청 유기농업과의 식구들께서 이 자리에 함께해 주셔서 굉장히 기쁜 마음입니다. 재생 유기농업 팀이 신설되었다는 반가운 소식을 전해주셨습니다. 우리 앞에는 많은 과제들이 있습니다. 탄소를 다시 되돌리는 농업을 활성화하기 위한 노력도 해야 되고, 우리에게 소비자와 연결도 필요하고, 신뢰를 보증할 인증제도 있었으면 좋겠고, 검증된 재생 유기농업의 농업적인 방법론들이 구축될 필요도 있고, 농기구도 필요합니다. 하지만 가장 중요한 것은 저는 사람이라고 생각합니다. 흙과 생명은 함께 진화해 왔고, 흙이 없다면 생명도 없다는 이 평범한 이치를 잊지 않고 오늘도 내 발밑에 혁명을 만들어 가려는 그런 사람들 말입니다. 그 여정은 단거리 전력 질주로는 이루어지지 않습니다. 먼 길을 가야 합니다. 인디언 속담에 먼 길을 가려며 함께 가라고 하고 있죠. 이 자리에 모이신 분들이 지구농부들의 긴 여정을 함께 해주는 그런 든든한 친구들이 되어주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 그리고 우리 친구들의 힘이 모여서 지구의 어떤 회복력을 함께 만들어갈 수 있기를 바랍니다. 함께해 주셔서 감사합니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 파타고니아에서 일하고 있는 김광현이라고 합니다. 반갑습니다. 제가 이 행사 기획을 이렇게 말씀을 들으면서 이 계획 축하의 말을 좀 했으면 좋겠다 시작할 때 이런 말씀을 듣고, 작년에도 그랬었고 올해도 그렇고, 저희가 감히 1년에 발이나 흙에 흙 한 번 묻히지 않고 살고 있는 저희가 농사에 대해서 어떤 말씀을 드릴 수 있을까 고민을 오늘 아침까지 많이 했습니다. 그런데 감히 저희가 농사에 대해서는 드릴 말씀이 없고, 그냥 저는 파타고니아에서 일하고 있으니까 파타고니아 이야기를 그냥 드리는 걸로 하면 좋겠다 생각을 했습니다. 제가 본사가 미국에 있어서 미국에 자주 가는데, 갈 때마다 이본 슈나드 회장님을 비롯한 파타고니아를 창업한 저희 창업자 세대 어르신들과 차를 마시거나 식사를 하거나 그렇게 시간을 말씀을 따로 나눌 수 있는 기회가 많이 있습니다. 그분들은 올해 다 연세가 70에서 80 가까이 되신 분들이고, 다 텃밭에서 본인이 드실 채소를 일구면서 살고 있는 분들인데, 그분들과 식사를 같이 하다가 파타고니아가 올해로 50주년이 되었는데, 이렇게 50년 동안 환경 보호라는 뜻을 한결같이 유지할 수 있었던 비결은 무엇이냐라고 제가 여쭤본 적이 있습니다. 그분들이 이렇게 곰곰이 하시다가 웃으면서 말씀을 해주셨는데, 혹시 낙숫물이 바위를 뚫는다라는 속담을 알고 있냐? 우리는 정말로 지구를 살리고 싶었고 환경을 지키고 싶었는데, 그러기 위해서는 이 이윤의 극대화라는 관행적인 비즈니스 방식, 그리고 이 지구를 착취하고 있는 자본주의라는 경제 시스템이라는 바위 위에 우리는 지난 50년 동안 물방울을 꾸준하게 떨어뜨리고, 그리고 그 물방울을 떨어뜨릴 수 있는 사람들을 늘리고 그 사람들과 함께 해왔다고 생각한다. 바위에 흔적이 생겼는지 그리고 구멍이 났는지 잘 모르겠다. 하지만 우리에게 중요한 것은 이 물방울이 계속해서 떨어지게 하는 것이다. 이런 말씀을 저에게 해주신 적이 있습니다. 여기 이 자리에 계신 분들은 크거나 작거나 농사에 대해서 농업에 대해서 어떤 뜻을 갖고 계신 분들이라고 생각합니다. 그 뜻은 작게는 적어도 나의 밭과 나의 논에는 농약을 치지 않겠다, 비닐 멀칭을 하지 않겠다일 수도 있고, 크게는 나는 도시의 삶을 버리고 농사의 삶으로 들어서겠다는 개인적으로는 거대한 삶의 전환일 수도 있을 것 같습니다. 하지만 그렇게 뜻 있는 삶은 아까 영상에서 어떤 농부님께서 말씀하셨는데 쉽지 않을 거라고 생각합니다. 그렇게 쉽지 않은 순간에, 쉽지 않음을 느끼는 순간에 여러분들이 하고 계시는 농사, 그리고 농업에 대해서 갖고 있는 이 뜻은 척박하고 가무는 관행농이라는 땅 위에, 그리고 이 기후위기와 자본주의라는 시스템이라는 바위에 물방울, 떨어지고 있는 한 방울의 물방울이라고 생각합니다. 그리고 그 물방울을 계속해서 떨어뜨리고 있는 그 여러분의 뜻에 대해서 감사의 말씀을 드리고 싶습니다. 파타고니아는 지난 몇 년 동안도 그렇고 앞으로도 그랬듯이 지구를 생각하는 농법, 이 물방울이 계속해서 떨어질 수 있도록 힘을 보태도록 하겠습니다. 마지막으로 우리가 이렇게 논이나 밭에 작물이 잘 자라고 있는 거를 이렇게 지나가다가 아니면 차를 타고 가다가 보면 그 아름다운 자연에 이렇게 감탄할 때가 많은데, 사실은 그 자연을, 그 밭과 논을 일구기 위해서 누군가가 매일 새벽마다 일어나서 농사를 짓고 땀을 흘리고 있다는 사실을 잘 모르는 경우가 많은데요. 오늘 이런 큰 행사를 열려면 보이지 않는 곳에서 땀을 흘리고 준비하고 있는 사람들이 있습니다. 여기 지금 마르쉐, 그리고 특히 이 행사를 준비한 공간을 대여하고, 그리고 여기 들어오다 보면 포스터를 붙이고 안내문을 쓰고 이렇게 몇 주 동안, 그리고 오늘 새벽부터 나와서 이 행사를 준비하느라 애를 많이 쓴 마르쉐의 실무 직원분들께 큰 감사 인사를 드리고요. 그리고 저에게 말고 이 행사를 준비한 이 마르쉐 친구들에게 큰 박수를 주시면서 제 인사를 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
첫 번째 강연은 미겔 알티에리 교수님께서 해주실 예정인데요. UC버클리 환경과학 및 정책학부 교수이며 라틴 아메리카 농업생태 연구센터 CELIA라고 하는 곳의 연구자이십니다. 농업생태학자로 기후위기 시대 산업농업의 대안으로서 토양을 회복하고 생명다양성을 유지하는 농민의 이야기를 널리 전하고 계십니다. 자, 영상으로 만나보시겠습니다.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to the conferences Farming Making the Planet Resilient. I am in rural Colombia, so the connection is not very good, so I apologize for that. As you know, we're confronting a planetary crisis. We have climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, armed conflicts, which are in Israel and Russia, which are raising the cost of food, raising the cost of fertilizers, and a food crisis that is due to poverty, lack of access to land, but also to food prices that are increasing due to all these economic problems that we're facing in the world. One of the key problems is climate change, which is reaching a point of no return, in which we are already experiencing before scientists expected severe droughts, extreme precipitation, high temperatures, heat waves, constant flooding. Many farmers, small farmers, are facing many problems. The average temperature in 2013 reached above 1.48 pre-industrial levels. During 180 days, about half of the year, the temperatures were above 1 degrees centigrade threshold. So nor the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement or the 28 COPs have been successful in setting a path to avoid climate catastrophe. Greenhouse emissions increased 65% since the country sat down to negotiate. So really, governments have not been able to raise to the challenge of solving the problem or taking action. So these effects of streams, the effects of the extreme climatic events, for example, here in Colombia, many small farmers are suffering from floods or droughts in different parts. And what is interesting is that the warming, there are countries that are responsible historically for the emissions, United States, Europe, the northern countries, the rich countries, and that has repercussions on the poorest areas of the world. So climate change is affecting the most vulnerable people on the planet, especially in the rural areas, majority of the world population, who contributed very minimal to the global environmental destruction. Small farmers don't emit gases to the level that promote climate change. There are other industry and industrial agriculture have been more responsible. So many farmers have had to migrate due to climate change. Between 2008 and 2016, 25.5 million people were displaced each year due to weather-related events. And this climate migration is expected to surge up to 1.2 billion by 2050 due to climate change and natural disasters. So what are we going to do with all these people? I mean, either we're going to be some of the people that are going to migrate, or we're going to be receiving them. So climate change is affecting global food production, especially industrial agricultural systems, with a global decline in yields by 250 due to climate change of about 16% on average. But the increase in food prices of wheat, rice, and corn is going to be about 150%. And that's going to have a major impact, especially on the poor people. So part of the problem that has caused, biodiversity loss, climate change, and so many problems is industrial agriculture. 80% of the 1.5 billion hectares of global agricultural systems are under high input homogeneous monocultures that are dependent on external inputs, pesticides, fertilizers, petroleum, and that they are vulnerable to pests and diseases. You have to inject about 5.2 billion pounds of pesticides every year to control the pests in these systems, and we still lose about 30% of the yield due to pests, despite the fact that we're injecting all these pesticides, because many pests become resistant to pesticides. So although we could be feeding humankind with about 250,000 plant species, actually there are 3, corn, wheat, and rice, that provide 50% of the calories that humans are consuming today. And this is not because we just love, wheat, corn, and rice, because the corporate system has narrowed the choices of humans to 3 crops mainly. And this simplification of the landscapes has implications for the stability of production. For example, here, you can see that the losses are very high when you have very few crops on a landscape. On a region, for example, you have 2 crops. Well, that's going to be your harvest losses, but probabilities are going to increase. But as you enhance the diversity of crop species in the landscape, then your possibilities of harvest loss due to pest or climate change are going to diminish. So it is very important for resiliency to increase the diversity of crops in the landscape. And unfortunately, the direction is the contrary. So here you see organic farmers in California back in the 80s that were growing, strawberry, for example, between complex vegetation, surrounded by forest and woodlands. But then all that changed, and now the intensification agriculture has led to these incredible monocultures, which have advanced at the expense of this natural vegetation, losing ecological services. So it is important then to have a biodiverse landscape surrounding the fields. For example, here in this photograph from Asia, we have rice fields surrounded by complex vegetation. And then in this system, the researchers found that predators are much more abundant than in the rice fields that are surrounded by forests than in the rice fields that are surrounded by other rice fields. And this has very important implications, because when you simplify the landscape and you have rice surrounded by rice, then you're going to decrease the richness and abundance of beneficial insects, predators, and parasites that control the pests. So your pests are going to go up, and then pesticide use is going to go up, and your production cost is going to increase. And this is happening in many parts of the world. Here in Colombia, for example, farmers traditionally use agroforestry systems where you have coffee associated with about 150 different plant species. And with the modernization, with the intensification, then there is a tendency now to have monoculture coffee or coffee with one shade tree species, losing biodiversity and also the ecosystem services associated with that. So for example, here you have an agroforestry system of coffee with many, many trees that are providing many ecological functions. For example, the trees produce leaves that fall down, they serve as fertilizer, Here in the monoculture, you have to apply fertilizers. Here the system, the complex system has shade, which ameliorates increases water retention by diminishing evapotranspiration. Here you have high evapotranspiration. So here you can see that the evapotranspiration is much higher in a coffee system that doesn't have any shade compared to a coffee system that has a lot of shade. And this has implications because when a drought comes and you don't have irrigation, these monoculture systems are going to suffer. They're vulnerable, they're less resilient. So industrial agriculture, despite the fact that it's occupying 70 to 80% of the arable land, they only produce 30% of the global food. Actually, most of the food that they produce is for export, for cattle, and for biofuels, bioplastics, and not for feeding people. Actually, the people that are feeding the world are the small farmers. And they use 70% of the water, 80% of fossil fuels, produces more than 30% of the greenhouse gases. So I don't know why we continue having this agriculture that is not sustainable, that is attempting against nature, and that is actually very susceptible to climate change and doesn't feed the world. So we need to increase food production in a sustainable way. It's a necessary condition, but not sufficient to feed the world. But we're going to have probably less arable land. We're going to have less petroleum, less water, less nitrogen. We're going to have in a scenario of climate change, a lot of social unrest and financial crisis. And we agroecologists say that this challenge of increasing food production in a sustainable way is not possible with the existing industrial agriculture model and its biotechnological derivations. You cannot solve the problem with the same mentality that created it. You need to have a different approach, and this is where agroecology comes in. So what we're talking about is the transition, the conversion of high input systems, monocultures, highly degrading, dependent on external inputs, to sustainable systems that are more diverse, more resilient, but they are not intensive in inputs, but they are intensive in information, in knowledge, because you go from an agriculture of inputs to an agriculture of processes, where when you have biodiverse systems, you have interactions between the different components promoting ecological processes that are fundamental for agricultural systems to function. So we're looking for an agriculture that is decoupled from fossil fuel dependence, that have low environmental impact, that are nature friendly, that are resilient to climate change, that are multifunctional. Not only they produce food, but they produce ecological services. They maintain social organization in the rural areas. They maintain the cultural traditions, the gastronomy, etc. And they are the foundation of local food systems, because by the year 2030, 80% of the world population is going to live in cities, and one city of 10 million people has to import 6 million tons of food per day, which travels about 1,000 kilometers. That's totally unsustainable. We need to create local food systems, regional food systems. So what we're looking for is an agriculture that has high diversity, high productivity, and high efficiency. And that comes about by creating diversified systems where you integrate crops and livestock and trees, you have high recycling rates, and you don't depend on external inputs. So this is where agroecology comes. Agroecology is a science that creates a dialogue of wisdoms between the knowledge of traditional farmers and the knowledge of modern agricultural sciences like ecology and biological control, basic agricultural sciences like soils, plant pathology, etc., as well as social sciences. And from that dialogue then comes principles. And those principles take different technological forms depending on the social, environmental, and economic conditions of each part. So agroecology is not a set of recommendations, it's not a set of practices, it is a set of principles that take the form of practices. So basically you have the principles, then the practices, and those practices promote processes, like for example, organic matter accumulation, nutrient cycling, biological pest control, water conservation. Those are the processes that are needed for the system to produce and be resilient. And those come about the application of principles that take the form of practices, and then they set in motion these processes, which leads to an agricultural system that is healthy, with lots of soil fertility, high productivity, and high resiliency. So small farmers throughout the world are very close to this agroecological approach. They've been practicing, diversified farming systems for centuries. They occupy only 25 to 30% of the land, but they produce 50 to 75% of the food, depending on the country. They use very little water, very little fossil fuel, so they're very efficient. And this is the basis of why we should do land reform, so that more small farmers are created, because they're much more productive, much more efficient. The traditional knowledge of farmers, as I said, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, farmers have had systems for more than 5,000 years. They have stood the test of time. So for example, this rice field here with terraces, you will find that the farmers have rice, many varieties of rice mixed together. At the same time, there are perennial plants, fruit trees, and other trees present. And then during the non-rainy season, the dry season, then they do rotation with other crops. So there's temporal and spatial diversity. And there are other components that are very important. For example, fish. The carps are a very important source of protein for the people, but at the same time, they play a function. They eat weeds, or they also can control the pests, the insect pests on the rice. Also, they sponsored azolla, which is fixes nitrogen, more than 200 kilos per hectare, which about 40% of it is utilized by the rice, and so you don't need fertilizers. And then they also bring in ducks that play very important roles in controlling weeds, in controlling snails, insects, and also producing manure. So basically, as these farmers are doing, agroecology is is the art of assembling biodiversity. You have the ducks, the rice, the fish, the azolla, and then these components start interacting. And through their interactions, then they sponsor the fertility of the system, they control the pests, the weeds, and they allow the system to be resilient and productive. In other regions, like here in Latin America, small farmers use polycultures, usually what they call the milpa, corn, bean, squash association, very important. Many studies have been done on these systems. There are interactions above and below ground. So many studies have been done looking at the productivity, the resilience, and many ecological processes that happen in these complex systems. So for example, above ground, when you have the different plants, then different plants determine a very complex food web of insects. You have herbivores that attack the crop, but at the same time, you have a complex of beneficial insects, predators, and parasites that control those pests. So much of the research has shown that actually the pest abundance is much higher in monocultures than in polycultures, because in the polycultures, you provide environmental opportunities for beneficial insects to thrive and control the pest. At the same time, weed control also is enhanced, because you occupy the niche of the weeds with different crops. So corn, beans, there's not enough space for the weeds. When you take out the beans, then the weeds start growing profusely. Here you have amaranthus and portulaca and other species. And then research has shown, for example, the study in India, that when you have a sorghum monoculture, you would have 1.73 tons per hectare of weeds, as opposed to, and the sorghum yield would be about 1.97 tons per hectare in the weedy field. But if you introduce cowpea, as an intercrop, you can see that you reduce the population of the weeds about 4 times. You get 0.44 tons per hectare, and the yields of the sorghum go up. So, it's a very efficient way of controlling weeds, but at the same time enhancing the yields of the crop. And then below ground, there are many interactions happening: facilitation, resource sharing, complementarity. For example, if you intercrop maize with beans or with fava beans, the assumption is that the legume fixes nitrogen and gives it to the corn, and that's why the system works in favor of the corn. But actually, they have done research in China that has found out that fava beans exudate organic acids that acidify the rhizosphere, mobilizing the phosphorus that the maize absorbs. So it is fascinating that when you increase the root diversity, you increase also the amount of exudates from these roots that start, inducing plant growth, inducing the release of certain nutrients, and even there's research showing that they can induce resistance to diseases. So when you look at the yields of these systems, then, for example, you're comparing a corn monoculture with a bean monoculture with an intercrop of corn and beans. The way to calculate the yield of the polyculture is through what is called the land equivalent ratio. So basically, the yield of the corn in polyculture over the yield of corn in monoculture plus the yield of the bean in polyculture over the yield of bean in monoculture, and you get a value of 1.5 in this case. 1.5 means that you need 1.5 hectares of monoculture to get the same productivity of 1 hectare of polyculture. So in other words, you get 50% more land in monoculture to be able to equalize in order to get similar yields than the polyculture. And then many farmers go beyond annual polycultures, and they have agroforestry systems with different fruit trees mixed together, shrubs and trees and other crops. So, for example, this farmer in Mexico is growing, coffee is the main crop, but it's associated with 150 different plant species. 319 species actually, 250 natives and 63 introduced, 113 cultivated, of which one is the coffee. And so the farmer has to have a very complex knowledge about how to manage this system, because you need to know when to come in and harvest, when to prune, when to plant different species. And then from these complex systems, farmers get coffee, but also they get many other products like flowers, like canes, like citrus, plantains, bananas, and many others. And many of these go for local markets, national markets, even international markets. But the important thing also is that they enhance the food security of the family. There are families that only have to buy 10% of their food from outside because they already get most of the stuff from their agroforestry systems. Now, the other thing that is important is that many of the studies that have been done on climate change generalize that agriculture is going to be affected by climate change, but they actually ignore what the strategies that small farmers have been using to overcome climatic variability. In fact, many farmers prepare and adapt for climate change using a variety of agroecological strategies. For example, they use drought-tolerant local varieties, water harvesting, mixed cropping, opportunistic weeding, agroforestry systems, and many other water and soil conservation techniques. So studies have been done where very violent climatic events have happened. For example, Hurricane Mitch in 1998 in Central America. Well, the studies show that the earth farmed with soil conservation practices resisted more the impact of Hurricane Mitch than farmers managed under monoculture. Although the damage was significant throughout, agroecologically managed forms concern more soil and vegetation cover and suffered less erosion and mudslides and less economic losses. So, for example, the monocultures, you can see this mudslides basically took about a big chunk of the farm. Whereas if you walk 100 meters from that farm and you find this other farm in Honduras, you see that you have agroforestry systems, soil conservation practices like contour farming, which actually reduce mudslides. So the hurricane affected Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala, but you can see that in Honduras, where it was more severe, actually the agroecological farms suffered significantly less damage than the monoculture system due to the hurricane. Another case, the case of Hurricane Ike in Cuba, the areas under industrial monoculture suffered more damage and exhibited less recovery than diversified farms. After the hurricane, the average loss in the diversified farm was about 50% compared to 90 to 100% in monocultures. And the productive recovery was about 80 to 90%, and it was noticeable in 40 days after the hurricane in the diversified farms. So in this farm, you can see you have an agroforestry system, you have windbreaks and shelter belts that protect against the wind speed. So when you have this, the hurricane will probably put down all the banana trees, but will not blow them away like it happens with in monocultures where they don't have shelter belt. The trees, end up 20 meters away. So this is one they call recovery because they kind of put back the trees and then they put stones and sticks in order for them to become erect. So here you can see that the farms that were more diversified recovered much faster after 60 days after the impact of the storm than the more monoculture systems. Now, under drought conditions, one of the main strategies, obviously farmers can use drought-tolerant varieties, they can use water harvesting techniques, but adding organic matter to the soil is fundamental because organic matter affects the biological, physical, and chemical properties of the soil. And one of the properties that it affects is actually increasing water retention in the soil. So when we add organic matter, we improve the soil structure, we promote the proliferation of soil biology, we enhance nutrient and water retention, but we also boost soil fertility. And as we said, as we increase 1% organic matter in our soils, it can result in up to 20,000 gallons of available soil water per acre. So under drought conditions, fundamental to have organic matter in your soils because it will enhance your water availability and retention. And there are many practices to enhance organic matter conservation. Tillage, for example, with minimal soil disturbance helps retain soil carbon. You can also diversify or with intercropping or have crop rotations that you can actually increase the plant residues return to the soil. Different crops have different root structures and growth patterns, which can influence soil carbon sequestration. And cover cropping using legumes that can be in a rotation can actually help carbon get into the ground. And these crops can be plowed under as green manure, adding more carbon to the soil. And the last strategy, obviously, is applying organic amendments like compost and manure, which can significantly increase organic matter in the soil, improving thus the structure and enhancing its availability to retain water. Here is an example of farmers in the semi-arid conditions of the Sahel. They use a system called the Zai system, which is like a half moon, and that they fill with compost and organic matter that they bring many times from the termites mounds, and then they plant their crops, and they can be grown under very dry conditions because the organic matter retains moisture. So one indirect way to know how much organic matter you have in your soil, remember, 58% of the organic matter is carbon. So this is a simple test where you get 2 clods of soil, 2 aggregates, you put them in water, and then you wait maybe 12 to 24 hours. And then after that time, you can see if the clod has dissolved. And basically, if it dissolves, it means that it has very poor aggregate stability. That means it has low organic matter content. Whereas the other one that has resisted, has a stability of the aggregates, it resisted to be dissolved because it has a lot of organic matter, a lot of biological activity that produce certain glomalin and other compounds that maintain the aggregate stable. So that's a very indirect way of knowing how much organic matter you have in your soil. So many farmers have put together all these ideas, of intercropping and soil management, crop diversification in time and space, etc. And then they have set up farms that are resilient and sustainable. For example, this is a half-hectare farm in southern Chile with a rotation of crops. They divide the field in 6 plots. There's a rotation, and they're surrounded by fruit trees. They have a garden. They have a cow. They have chicken. And then after 3 years of the farm working under this design, they have high production. You can see 3.16 tons from the rotation, 112 tons from the home garden, from the trees surrounding the field, about 1 ton, milk, 3,200 liters, and then per year, and then eggs, 2,531, which a family of five is not going to eat all that. And so you have a surplus that you can sell in the market. So these farmers, for example, here, the economic viability and the food security of the farm comes from, first, they produce most of their food. They only buy salt, sugar, rice, and spaghetti, and oil. 2, their cost of production goes down about 50% because they don't require external inputs. And the surplus can be sold in the market. So you can see that these farmers then have a lot of possibilities of having food security, economic viability, and productive sovereignty. This is another example from Cuba. These farmers used to grow corn and tobacco. They got training from ANAP, the National Association of Agricultural Producers in agroecology. They redesigned their farm. This farm now is divided into different plots that have agroforestry systems, intercropping systems, pastures, silvopastoral systems, surrounded by a very complex network of hedgerows. These hedgerows play an important role in producing food, fodder, wood, and also in ameliorating the impact of hurricanes, which are becoming more and more common in the Caribbean. And you can see that the yield dependency, the dependency on external inputs went down to almost zero during a 15-year conversion period. And this farm can produce up to 34, can feed about up to 34 people with the protein produced in 1 hectare of the farm with an energy efficiency of 30. That means they put 1 kilocalorie of energy in the form of labor, and they receive 30 in the form of food. Very efficient. Actually, industrial agriculture has an energy efficiency of 1.5. So this agriculture is 20 times more energy efficient than industrial agricultural systems. But when we're talking about designing resilient farms, we cannot just talk about, designing farms that are biodiverse without trying to restore the landscapes that surround the farms. Because if you don't, no matter how much you do in your farm, if your landscape that is surrounding you is totally degraded, it doesn't have vegetation, that is going to be very difficult to reach resiliency at the farm level. That's why we need to also work at the landscape diversity. And so there are many elements, this is in Spanish, but there are many elements that you can use to restore the landscapes around your farm. One example, this is a farm, an area in Mexico that was totally degraded by deforestation, overgrazing, but farmers, instead of migrating to the north, they decided to stay by starting to restore their land. The first thing was to do reforestation of the top of the mountain to absorb water. Then they started soil conservation practices and water harvesting techniques by growing this, using these structures. And then there's only 3 months of rain during the rainy season, and the rest of the year is dry, so they have to store water. And without water, depending on how much water they were able to harvest, then they would devote a piece of land of different sizes, depending on the amount of water, to grow their crops like amaranthus, which is very rich in protein, corn and beans and other crops. Also, in another region of Colombia, for example, farmers started restoring the landscape around the farms to have water. So the watershed was reforested, but then they needed to change their systems of production, which was based in arracacha, which is the tuber crop, similar to potato, very degrading, very dependent on external inputs. What they did is they started changing the crops. So they started planting coffee with a temporary shade like Ricinus communis castor bean, with corridors of Tithonia diversifolia, which is a similar plant to sunflower, very rich in phosphorus, very used as a green manure, but also as a fodder crop, and also attracts beneficial insects with the flowers. So basically here you see they're cutting the Tithonia to leave it as a mulch in between the rows of the coffee. And then after 10 years of management like this, the system was converted into this agroforestry system with 15 different tree species in addition to coffee, avocado, citrus, bananas, etc., with the corridors of Tithonia, which is used as a green manure and also to attract beneficial insects and also to feed the animals. So agroecology is leading to the representization of many areas of the world, because by revitalizing small farms, agroecology moves peasants to autonomy out from inputs and markets and out of debt. That's fundamental. The second, by recovering and reconfiguring and restoring territories away from agribusiness via land reform, land occupation, and other mechanisms, you're also creating a process of representization. And by adopting agroecology in wide areas by thousands of farmers, that's another way of scaling up agroecology and creating a process of representization in many areas. So why is agroecology becoming so popular among social rural movements? Because it's socially activating, it requires participation of the people, it's economically viable because uses local resources, not external inputs, it's culturally appropriate, it respects traditional knowledge and mobilizes it. It's ecologically sound because it actually doesn't change the farming systems of the peasants, but rather optimizes them and provides the principles to reach food sovereignty. So today, Via Campesina and many other social movements have adopted agroecology as one of the main components of food sovereignty. Actually, food sovereignty has three pillars. One of them is agroecological strategies, social movements organize, and then the social movements pressure the state to support processes of land reform and to make land, water, and seeds available for small farmers. In fact, in 2015, the Via Campesina adopted agroecology as the main pillar, technological pillar of food sovereignty. And they say that agroecology within a food sovereignty framework offers farmers a collective path forward from the multiple crises of climate, food, environmental, public health promoted by the industrial food system. So transforming the food system will require a major shift from a market economy to a more solidarious economy, to a more circular economy with a greater reliance on alternative food networks. It will require reducing distance between producers and consumers, ensuring that food is healthy and accessible to all people. This is a very important requirement to democratize the food system, and that more wealth and jobs are created and retained within local economies. So basically what agroecology is talking about is that, first of all, food empire, the big corporations have strangled the food system, and they determine what farmers are going to produce, how much it's going to cost them, what inputs they need to do. And they also, because they are vertically stratified, they also own the big supermarkets, so they control what people are going to eat, the quality of the food, the price of the food. So we need to create a bypass. And that bypass is basically composed of territories that are managed agroecologically with alliances between consumers and producers, so that they can create alternative territorial markets that are solidarious. So, for example, there's one example in Brazil, Ecovida, which actually is a decentralized structure encompassing 180 municipalities, about 2,400 families of farmers, that is 12,000 people. which is actually in connection with consumers in cooperatives, NGOs, et cetera, thousands of people that support these farmers. So basically here you can see an association of producers that go to the market and they bring the food at a similar or lower price than conventional food, because the farmers have reduced their cost of production, so they don't need to sell the produce so expensive. So there are many, many benefits of supporting small farmers: enhance food sovereignty, promote local economic growth, generate employment, reduce poverty, promote diverse diets and better nutrition, and have local access to healthy food by all the people. But we cannot put all the weight of the change in the food system on the farmers. You know, we are all consumers, we all eat 3 times a day. So it will require an understanding from consumers that eating is both an ecological and political act. That every time I support local farmers instead of the corporate food chain, I am supporting and creating socio-ecological sustainability and resilience in my community. So we need to, one of the important role that farmers have is to help consumers to reach a higher consciousness about the multiple benefits of small-scale agriculture, to have an active participation of consumers in creating and strengthening the local food systems, you know, by creating this territorial markets, and also to pressure local regional governments to support agroecological strategies. So we need to scale up agroecology. And how can that be done? Well, there has to be more support for farmer-to-farmer networks, funding research and education at various levels on agroecology, providing public policies, taking specific actions to empower women and to maintain the young people in the countryside. And we need to create alliances between academia, NGOs, and rural social movements, and also the active participation of consumers. And there has been many, many studies that have been done around the world, in India, in Cuba, in Brazil, where agroecology has been massified, and they have found that there are several factors that are common in these scaling up experiences, but there are 3 that are fundamental. One, social organization, you know, because the social fabric is the growth media in which agroecology advances. You have to have networks of farmers and consumers to exchange information, to exchange practices, to share learning, and effective agroecological strategies that work, you know, different technologies that work, practices that work. You also have to have external allies, favorable markets, favorable policies, but those are subject to political will. I mean, public policies are important, and there are many countries in Latin America that have already some policies related to agroecology, especially Brazil has a national law of agroecology, and has many, many components. And one of them is the school lunch program, where municipalities have to buy 30% of the food from small farmers, which goes to feed about 45 million students a day, because there are more than 2,000 municipalities that participate. But that program that was created during the first government of Lula got stopped when Bolsonaro was in power, but now is being reactivated by the Lula government again. So it is subject to political will. This is why agroecology can advance without the need of government support, policies, and funding. So with that, I would like to finish, but the organizers sent me some questions that I wanted to answer very quickly. One of them is about how can we absorb sequestered carbon in the soil and how to measure it. I think I already talked about the fact that soils in general absorb about 20% of the global emissions. That is about 2 to 5 gigatons of CO2 per year. And one way to enhance the sequestering capacity is by adding organic matter to the soil. And I talked about the techniques that are used for that. Now, there are many, many tests that can be done to see how much carbon was sequestered in the soil. One of them is to measure organic matter content, whether it went up or not. But that requires farmers to take samples and send them to laboratories, many times expensive. not accessible. So a very quick method is the method that I show you with the clods in the water to see if they dissolve. Another one is to put water peroxide in soil, in a soil sample, and see the amount of effervescence. The more effervescent there is, the more organic matter in the soil. Or by indirectly by putting also tea bags buried in the soil about 8 centimeters, and then 1 week later collect them and see if they're still there. If they are totally dissolved, it means that there was a lot of biological activity in the soil, and biological activity means that there is organic matter, because the source of energy for biological activity is organic matter. So there are indirect ways, obviously qualitative methods, that can be used. The other question is about why agroecology is not being scaled up. Well, agroecology is growing. It has grown to the point that it today reaches many, many thousands of farmers. And this happened without government support, without policies, without support from foundations, without research, etc. So the reason why it's being scaled up is because there are no policies from the government in most countries. Most of the research in the universities is on industrial agriculture. The extension services are all promoting green revolution. Very few agroecology extensionists. I imagine in Korea, how many extensionists you have that are trained in agroecology. So there are institutional barriers that need to be overcome for agroecology to expand. Also, we require consumer awareness to support the farmers that are using agroecology, and in the creation of the local food markets that I told you. And the last question is about whether agroecology can feed the world. Well, a lot of people argue, well, we need the green revolution, we need biotechnology to feed the world. But the problem of hunger is not related to a lack of food. Actually, in the United States, you have more than 2 million people that are hungry, and there are more than 14 million people that are food insecure. And it's not because there's no food. It's because there's poverty, there's unequal access to land, unequal access to food, etc., etc. And so in order to solve the problem of hunger, we need to give land to people to farm. It's highly concentrated in the hands of a few. We need to also deal with poverty, because people that make $1 or $2 a day cannot purchase food, and the food prices are going up. So that's another huge limitation. We need to overcome poverty, and also we need to promote more research and more extension on agroecology, so that it becomes more and more productive and effective. So I hope that this presentation was useful to you, and I wish you good luck in your conference, which is very important. Farming, making the planet resilient. But what kind of farming? That's the question. And I would argue that is agroecological farming. Thank you.